Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's Author Chat. My guest today is Michelle Cameron. Michelle is the award-winning author of works of historical fiction and poetry. Beyond the Ghetto Gates, The Fruit of Her Hands, The Story of Shira of Ashkenaz, and In the Shadow of the Globe. Beyond the Ghetto Gates won a silver medal for historical fiction from the independent publisher Book Awards. Was first place best in category from the Chanticleer Goth Awards and was a finalist in the 2020 Forward Indies. Michelle is a director of the Writers Circle, a New Jersey-based organization that offers creative writing programs to children, teens, and adults. She lives in New Jersey with her husband and has 2 grown sons of whom she is inordinately proud. Welcome, Michelle. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your novel, Beyond the Ghetto Gates.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be here. A little bit more about myself. Well, one thing is that I grew up in Cedar Grove, so I'm quite close to Wayne. I have been a writer, I would say, since 4th grade. That's when I really got started doing it. I was working in corporate America until I had published my first novel, and then tried to find a way to make writing my full-time life. And I managed to do that by becoming one of the directors of the Writers Circle, where we, as you say, we teach creative writing for everyone from 3rd graders on up through adults. And I have to say, I'm particularly proud this month that 5 of my authors who were in novel classes with me are publishing this month. So it's kind of amazing to me.
Congratulations. That's
Thank
wonderful.
You. Thank you.
And Beyond the Ghetto Gates is your most recent publication. It was released in 2020.
It was, in April, no less.
Oh, at the start of the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, about the 2 women at the center of the story of the novel, Mirella and Francesca?
Sure, absolutely. So Beyond the Ghetto Gates takes place in 1796 and 97. When a 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte was on military campaign through Italy. When he came to the harbor city of Ancona in Italy, he discovered that the Jews were locked behind ghetto gates from sundown to sunup each day. And he sent his Jewish soldiers, and in fact, because of the French Revolution, he had Jewish soldiers, to demolish those gates and liberate the Jews. Beyond the Ghetto Gates deals with the reactions of both the Jewish and the Catholic populations in Ancona to that event. And specifically the 2 women that you mentioned. Mirella is a young Jewish woman who wants more than anything else to work with her father. Her father is the owner of a ketubah factory. A ketubah is a Jewish marriage certificate. And at this point in time, and this was something that I found during my research, ketubot, which is the plural, the Ancona was the world center of ketubah making, which I had no idea about. And there are these gorgeous illuminated things. And if you go, for example, off my website to my Pinterest page, I put a whole bunch of them from Ancona up there. And they're gorgeous. So she wanted to do that, but the city rabbi and her mother both objected strongly. The rabbi, because he said, well, no Jewish girl should work in a place where scribes are doing holy work. And the mother, because she said, honey, listen, we raised you to marry a rich man. That's going to be your contribution to the workshop. And as the story evolves, Mirella has to deal with what her mother wants. Francesca, on the other hand, is a Catholic wife and mother. She's married to what becomes not just a very cruel, but also eventually a murderous husband. She's a very devout woman, and the church has told her in no uncertain terms that she cannot, certainly can't divorce him, and has to basically help him, be a helpmeet to him. So she's very conflicted about what he does versus her own beliefs, but what she's also being told. She's raised to despise Jews. This is the background that she's gotten. And, you know, from her family, from her husband certainly, even from the church. And she becomes close, not intimately close, but acquaintance-wise close, with one of Napoleon's Jewish soldiers, someone by the name of Daniel. And her opinions start to change. Francesca was also the first witness of a miracle portrait of the Virgin Mary, which was in the cathedral in Ancona. And the really, as I mentioned, I found out about the Ketubot in Ancona. I also discovered that there was, in fact, this miracle portrait of the Virgin Mary, that supposedly it turned its head, it cried, it smiled. And the residents said, well, this means Napoleon won't be able to conquer us. They were wrong. But the fascinating thing is that one of my students actually helped me locate a Vatican document which contained this story and gave me the character of Francesca Maratti and her daughter Barbara. They're both mentioned in this document. So, yeah, no, so a lot of what happens in this book came as a result of my research.
Speaking of your research,
yes.
What is your process? How do you go about, well, how do you go about deciding, like, this is the time that I'm going to focus on, and gathering all the material to write the story?
Yeah. So first of all, I had no idea about this particular incident, and I find most people don't know about Napoleon and the Ghetto Gates. And it was when I was reading a nonfiction book by the name of Emancipation that I was able to, I discovered this story. And I said to myself, somebody should have written about this before, and I couldn't find anything. So I was like, great, okay. In terms of research, research can be dangerous for a historical novelist. We love research. We dive into it. We think everybody's going to be fascinated by what we're fascinated by. And the problem is that if it doesn't serve the story, readers get bored. So this is one thing you have to learn as a researcher of history, that is something that you have to be wary of. You have to serve the story in the details that you put into the book. In terms of my writing process and research, because I love it so much, I limit myself to 3 months of intense research. All I'm doing at that point is researching. I'm also finding the story. Because one thing I've learned too is you can throw a bunch of facts into a book, but if there's no story there, then nobody's going to care. So that 3 months is spent doing that. Then I start to write. And again, I limit myself to that 3 months because I could spend my whole life looking at the research. However, I will say that once I'm writing, and even while I'm revising, I'm probably still researching every single day, because I'm always coming across something I don't know. You know, what kind of dress did people wear? What would they have eaten for breakfast? How would they get from place to place? You know, all of these things. So I'm constantly looking those things up. And if I'm very deep in the story, what I'll do is I'll put a big note to myself, find this out, and I'll keep writing because I don't want to interrupt the flow. But that's basically the way I handle research.
And there are battle scenes in Beyond the Ghetto Gates. How difficult were those for you to write?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I have found that battles are certainly in this book, much more so in the sequel that will be, it's called Napoleon's Mirage. And he does this weird thing. He takes a whole bunch of his troops over to Egypt and Israel. And there are even more battle scenes there in that book. So I find that I'm sort of had to teach myself to write about battles. And it's challenging. You want to make battle scenes personal to the soldiers. You need to represent, you know, the pain and suffering that happens in them. I don't love writing about pain and suffering, and yet I really have to represent it fairly. So how difficult were they for me to write? They were. They were. And luckily I have some readers, early readers, who are invested in the fact that I've got to make them right. I will also add that I have been waiting for that Napoleonic enthusiast to come across, you know, read the book and say, okay, this is how you got it wrong. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. I'm sure it will.
I mean, just the gear and the weaponry. I mean,
yes,
that takes, and how, you know, the proximity. Because I mean, of course, you're dealing with swords, you know. So
absolutely, absolutely. It's interesting. My husband was in Israel for a time, and he brought me home this little souvenir of a couple of lead, you know, balls that would go into a musket, which I keep on my desk as I'm writing. But yes, you do. You have to know what would they use, how would they load that cannon, you know, what's the effect of a sword battle. You definitely have to know all of that.
And what lends this story, what lends itself to a sequel? Just Napoleon?
Well, Napoleon and also the Jewish themes in the book. This one I very much wanted, after I wrote The Fruit of Her Hands, which takes place in the Middle Ages. It's about my ancestor who was a rabbi during the 1200s. And it's about the rise of anti-Semitism. And again, it was kind of brutal in places. So for Beyond the Ghetto Gates, I was looking for that happy Jewish episode. How many of those have we had? Not many. And so the fact that, you know, there was the emancipation of the Jews during this period was definitely a happy episode. The sequel does follow Napoleon and his next step. In terms of the Jewish themes, there is a theory, and I'm calling it a theory because I've been in contact with a couple of historians who literally fought them one and another. Yes, this happened. No, this didn't happen. Where the theory is that Napoleon offered the Jews of Israel a Jewish homeland if they helped him. Again, not widely known and very fiercely contested. I can tell you, it was actually a lot of fun to watch these two historians go at one another over this. So, and because I write fiction, I get to say, yes, this definitely happened.
That is a great piece of history. That is a fantastic piece of history. And then that's what you found out more about? No, you found out more about Ancona through the Vatican.
Right, right, yes, no, definitely. In Napoleon's Mirage, among the things that I, again, from research, that I was very fortunate, is that I found the chronicles of an Egyptian Muslim character. And so I made him a character in the book. And doing that, I said, okay, I'm definitely going to need a sensitivity reader for this book, and found one, and she was marvelous. And I was very pleased to find that a lot of what she pointed out, I could change, but also that my research had given me enough perspective into Islam that she wasn't saying you're a total idiot, which is always good.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I was gonna say, you just mentioned that your first story was in the Middle Ages, and now you're in the 1790s. I assume you just love history as a whole.
I do.
Why, like, is there one particular time in history that you prefer to write about than another?
I don't think so. So I have 2 books coming out in the next 2 years. And the first one, which will be out in just a little less than a year from now, in September of 2023, it takes place in 600 BCE. It's all about the Babylonian exile. So I definitely write Jewish historical fiction. I think that's the thread. But I find the entire history of the Jews fascinating, and particularly, again, those incidents that nobody knows about. I'm in the process, because those 2 books are being, they're in the hands of my publishers. I'm in the process of researching my next book, and that is going to take place during the Maccabee period. And I'm finding that the Hanukkah story is definitely, not really accurate. So that's going to be an interesting thing to write about.
So will it be a Hanukkah themed story, or?
It will have the Maccabees and all of those elements in it. But yeah, there was more to the story than just, wow, we've recovered the temple and the candle burned for 8 days. It's a lot more to the story.
There always is. There always is.
Absolutely.
Writing sequels, is it hard to write sequels to keep the continuity, to keep the characters fresh, but still, remembering what they said and what they did in the previous book?
No, it absolutely is difficult. One of the things that I struggled with in writing the sequel is you want a new reader to be able to pick up the book and read it, even if they didn't read the previous book. So there is a certain amount of backstory you do have to build in, but you don't want to build so much backstory in that the reader of the previous book is like, okay, I know all this. So that's a really hard balancing act. And then in terms of, there has to be a new story. So the same characters, but they have to develop further, they have to grow further. And hopefully I've accomplished that.
Well, hopefully, and good luck
Thank you.
With both. You mentioned that you started writing when you were very young. Can you tell us what inspired you to start writing?
I really believe that some people are born writers. Honestly, I do. And the impulse to write, the drive to write, I think is something that was just there in me. I've actually witnessed it in one of my 2 sons. When he was very young, he would get up in the morning and sit down at the little desk we gave him, and he would just start writing stuff. And he didn't even need to show them to us. He'd like squirrel it away, and in summers when he was out in camp and we were cleaning out the room, we would be finding things that he'd written during the year and be like, wow, this is really interesting. So I do feel like that is something. But I also feel like it is something that you have to learn your craft. It's not just the drive to write, that you also have to learn, how to create character, what a narrative arc is, how to create a compelling story. So all the attributes of good writing, there's a lot to learn there.
Absolutely. Do you have like a set schedule? Do you work better in the mornings or in the evenings? Do you plot your books? Do you have like a long outline and then just go from there?
So I am definitely a morning person. And in fact, when I was working full time, when my sons were younger, I had finished about 1/3 of The Fruit of Her Hands. And I went to a conference and took a workshop called Finishing Your Novel. And I said, okay, here are all the reasons why I just don't have enough time. And everybody around me, the writers around me are nodding, but the instructor, bless her heart, says to me, okay, you're a morning person. How early can you get up? So for about 5 years, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning to write. And it was gorgeous. This was the days before the internet, really, and Facebook, and my children were asleep, and no one was yelling "Mom." So it was great. And I'd take about 2 hours, and then I'd get ready to go to work. So yeah, definitely a morning person. In terms of plotting, so because I write historical fiction, the first thing I do is set up a timeline. And I say, I have to hit these dates. I have to, these are the events. But I tend to, in between that, to write, they call it being a pantser, writing by the seat of your pants. So I know what I have to hit, I know where I have to go, but I'm not quite sure. And the best thing I find about writing are those days when your characters take you for a ride and they say, all right, you thought you were going here, but in fact, we're taking you in this direction. And so those are the marvelous days in writing.
I have to agree. I have to agree. And what do you think makes a good story?
Well, certainly conflict. There is no story without conflict. And so now you can take that too far. I was actually listening on my way over here about the first instance of jumping the shark in television. And so, I find this is a problem with, for instance, series that have gone on for too long, and they have to keep finding new ways of making things difficult. But I also think, in addition, obviously, to conflict, you want characters that your readers can root for. They may not necessarily like them, but they have to be able to root for them and have some affinity towards what they're accomplishing and what their goals are. So definitely answering the question of what does your character want is also a really big deal in creating story.
About how long does it take you to write a book?
Usually it takes about 2 years. Maybe a little longer, depending. Beyond the Ghetto Gates, I think I have never revised a book as much as I revised this one. And so that, I think, elongated the process. But, I got really good feedback from my beta readers, from my then agent, who actually worked with me for a year to improve the novel. And I wanted to follow all of that. So like I said, it got revised a lot. So I think Beyond the Ghetto Gates probably took me closer to 3 years, maybe even a little longer.
Wow. And how do you feel about editing and revision?
I think they are absolutely critical to being a professional author. I teach teens, and I will also often tell them that the difference between an amateur and a professional is the professional will revise, will edit. The thing about writing is that it's all locked in your head. And so, and you think you get it down, but you don't always. And so you do need other people to come along and say, I didn't understand this, or, you could do this, and it would really improve it. Like I think everybody else, my first instinct when I'm getting edits or suggestions is like, wait, no, don't tell me that. I've done great. But then you sort of have to say, all right, come back to that with an objective and look at the opportunity. So yeah, I would say, like most authors, I don't love you know, the process, but I value the process a great deal.
Yes. It is important.
It is
not a well-edited book.
No, and I'm sure you've seen plenty of not well-edited books.
Plenty. And I won't say necessarily it's, you know, like the self-published versus the traditional published. I've seen it in both.
Of course, of course. Yeah, I think one of the problems with the traditionally published books these days is they are so short-staffed in a lot of ways, and the rush to get something through. And I know that sounds weird because, you know, the process usually takes between, you know, between 2 years and 18 months to get a book out. Mm-hmm. But even so, I think they've got a lot of work piled up on a variety of books, and so that makes it difficult.
So what was your publishing journey? I know you have published with different publishers.
Yeah.
That first call, what was that like?
Well, so with The Fruit of Her Hands, it was a very traditional press. It was in a different, I'm not represented now, but I've been represented by 2 different agents. With that first call, it was after some 14 very kind rejections for the book. This was the last one out there. And so, I mean, it was marvelous. It was the most amazing thing. And then, you know, after my agent called me, then my editor called me, and we had this lovely, lovely conversation. And it was wonderful. And frankly, I thought I had it made. I mean, you don't do better than Simon & Schuster. But things change in the publishing world. One of the things that happened is my editor was let go 3 days before the book came out. And I always say, if it had been 3 months, the book may not have appeared. And that meant I lost my advocate in the publishing house. And they basically said, well, we've thrown the spaghetti at the wall, we'll see if it sticks. And it didn't for them. So with my next book, which was about the Babylonian exile, they passed on it because they had right of first refusal. And because of the year it was, 2009, a lot of other people very, very kindly passed on it. And I put it in a drawer. And I started writing Beyond the Ghetto Gates. And again, I had a lovely agent. She worked with me tirelessly to get the book into shape. She sent it to all the mainstream publishers. They all passed, again, kindly, but passed. And then a friend of mine came along and said, look, there's this new way of publishing called hybrid publishing. It's not self-publication. They're selective. They work with you, you know, they have an editorial staff, they have really good artists, you know, this was my publisher, my cover rather, and they have distribution through Ingram Publishing Services, which is how the big boys distribute their books in a lot of cases. The problem, or not the problem, the challenge with She Writes Press and other presses like that is that you, the author, have to invest in your own publication. And that investment isn't small. It's not small. On the other hand, their royalty structure is much, much better for the writer, and you start getting money back right away. So I was very pleased with that whole process. They were also a great deal more transparent, frankly, than Simon & Schuster. They told you what you would do, and they told you what you wouldn't do. So I brought the sequel to them, mainly because it is a sequel, and I want the books to look and feel part of a set. But then in the meantime, someone let me know about this new Jewish imprint, Wicked Sun Press, which is a small press, and I said, you know, I've got Babylon sitting in my drawer. It's been sitting in my drawer for 15 years. I'll give it a shot. And they were silent for a long time, and I was like, yeah, okay, no big deal. And then suddenly, I would say it was at least 6 months after I had submitted it, they came back and said, you know, you sent us a query. We'd love to see the full manuscript if you're still interested. So I sent them that. And then they came back, I think it was 3 months later. It's a long process to do this. And basically said, we'd like to get on the phone with you. And you know, as a writer, if you're getting on the phone, you're getting an offer. Now, I haven't been through the process entirely with them so far. I would say that they have been very, they're kind of in between Simon & Schuster and She Writes. They're not as transparent. I probably shouldn't be saying this. But they're also much more amenable to like my suggestions, and we've talked already about promotion, and we've talked about cover design. So that's all good. I have high hopes with them that they will, you know, they're very concerned about what the book's going to look like and how the market's going to react to it. And, you know, the publisher at one point got on the phone with me and said, you know, I love this book. You can't get better than that. Yeah. And I don't think he's going anywhere. You know, knock on wood, he's not going anywhere.
A lot of small publishers and imprints have popped up over the last, you know, probably 10 years.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And they're doing well. It's the distribution. If they get the distribution.
Yeah. Well, ironically, this press distributes through Simon & Schuster. So there you go.
Full circle.
Exactly. Exactly.
Have you had any memorable reader encounters with this book or your previous book?
I think certainly I've had people who have come to, so all right, one nice example. I was at the New Providence Book Festival this weekend, which was absolutely lovely. And someone came up to me and she says, I have your book. A friend of mine insisted that I purchase a copy. I read it, I devoured it. It was amazing. And so that was, you know, being in person with someone like that was absolutely lovely. I've certainly had, you know, you aren't supposed to look at your Amazon reviews, but you do anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I always find it interesting, the people who, you know, take issue with any of my books. And usually I can just sort of say, all right, you know, it wasn't for you. But I did have one person who I was in a book club with, all via Zoom, because this was pandemic time. And she wrote in her Amazon review, you know, it really wasn't my kind of book, and I got bored, but then I heard about all the research Michelle had done, and that kind of changed my mind about the book. So it was interesting that, you know. So it's always interesting to hear what your readers, obviously you want your readers to love your book, but you do have to realize it's not for everybody. My oldest son doesn't read my books. He's you know, he's a computer programmer. He loves fantasy. He loves science fiction. This isn't it. Yes.
But Mom wrote it.
I know. I know.
I will ask, are you a member of a writers group, or do you have critique partners?
So I do definitely have certain people who I'm very fortunate. I belong to the Historical Novel Society, and that's very helpful because people who I ask to read my book know what makes a good historical novel vis-a-vis just a good novel. I'm also incredibly fortunate that through the Writers Circle, because I'm one of the directors, I got to take our Revising Your Manuscript class. The woman who teaches that, Vanessa de Souza, is an amazing editor. So that was wonderful. My business partner, Judith Lindbergh, will read my work. And then my favorite reader of all, and this is who the book is dedicated to, is my son, Alex, who works in publishing, believe it or not, works at Macmillan at their sci-fi fantasy arm, and who's a fabulous editor. And so even though he doesn't work in editorial at the publishing house. And so he has been extremely generous in reading my books. I think he read Beyond the Ghetto Gates at least 4 times in my various versions of it. And I really rely on his opinions. So yes, definitely. Am I in a writer's group itself? I'm not at the moment, and I kind of miss it. I was at the beginning. But between the writer's circle itself and my writing, it's hard to find the time.
I can imagine, yes. And can you tell us a little more about the writer's circle?
So yes, so we, as I said, we teach everyone from 3rd graders on through adults. With the kids, it's mostly just, we do have certain genre classes. For example, we have an Out of This World class, which does sort of the sci-fi fantasy arm of things. We have this amazing instructor who teaches horror and dark matters for the older kids. And we've just introduced, and this came out of our summer program, which I'll talk a little bit more about, we just introduced a teen poets circle with poet Catherine Doty, who's amazing. I've taken classes with Kat. She's just unbelievable. But, you know, for the most part, our kids' classes take place weekly. We have both Zoom as well as in-person classes. Then when we get to the adults, we have a full array of genre, everything from poetry to short fiction to I teach our novel track. So I start with, in this fall, I'm starting with beginning your novel again, but I teach beginning your novel, continuing your novel, and something called the novel continuum. We also have memoir and creative nonfiction, as well as our adult writer circles, which are multi-genre facilitated workshops. So you can come in, you bring whatever you're working on, you share it with the group, etc. We insist that all of our instructors are published authors. We feel like that makes a huge difference to the quality of the program. You know, and during the summers, we also teach for the little kids, we have a mini camp that's like a week-long mini camp called Word Smash. And then for the teenagers, we teach at Drew University our summer creative writing intensives for 3 weeks. That is a 9 to 3:30 program. These kids will blow your mind. These are the kids who love to write. That's actually how we bill it, for teens who love to write. And they are unbelievable writers. And they find their tribe when they come to us. Because, you know, if they're at their regular school, maybe there's one other person who loves to write. Well, suddenly they're in a room with 40 kids who love to write. And they make lifelong friends. It's amazing. We just published our summer journal with their work. So if you visit, you know, our website, which is the Writers Circle Workshops, very long.com, you can get to our journal and read some of their work. But it's an unbelievable 3 weeks.
Sounds like, oh, I'm sure the kids love it.
Oh, they do. They really do.
And what advice would you give a new writer that's just starting out?
First of all, that you have to put, a lot of writers say this, the first writing's going to be terrible, but you have to have the courage to put it down on the page. I've had a lot of writers come and say, you know, I have these great ideas. I walk around all the time, but you know, it never shows up on the page. It's not going to be great the first time around. You have to get it down. But again, I'm quoting another writer, you can't edit a blank page. And so it is definitely in the revision, in the editing, that you become a better and better writer. Obviously, I would love people to join us at the Writers Circle, because what that also gives you is it gives you accountability. I can't tell you how many people, when they're not in session with us, come back and say, I haven't written a word. I'm so glad to be back, because now you're making me write. And often you have to be made to write. Even I, some days, you know, it's like, okay, put the seat in the chair and write. I guess my one other piece of advice is don't wait for the muse. Don't wait for inspiration.
Really?
Really. I'm going to tell an Alex is my youngest son, I'm going to tell an Alex story here. When he was at home in high school writing, during the summers, we wouldn't let him do this. Otherwise, he would stay up till like 3 or 4 in the morning writing. And what he said is, okay, my muse is named Angela. I don't know why. But I make a date with her. I show up. Sometimes she does, sometimes she doesn't, but I'm there waiting. You know, and not waiting, writing. And I think this is necessary for writers to realize that inspiration is a fickle mistress. Mm-hmm. You've got to do the work, and sometimes it's just a matter of just doing your best to write, even if it's not through inspiration. Inspiration shows up eventually.
That's good. I mean, it's hard to, you know, to wrap your head around, because if it's not coming, then you're just staring at the blank page, or you're just writing stuff that is upsetting you because, you know, it's not great, not as good as yesterday, you know. Like
yeah, no, I think we all have those. I call those my chipping stone days. We all have those days. But I also feel like, you know, with writer's block, the only way out of writer's block is through writing. Even if it's terrible, even if you throw it out, that whole process of writing gets you there.
That is true. If you make it like, you know, your job, you have
Yes.
to be there and you have to get something down.
Exactly, exactly.
And my last question is always a fun question. Have you visited any of the locations you've written about?
So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get to Ancona.
Not yet?
Not yet. And I was not able to get to Rothenburg, which is a big part of the Fruit of Her Hands. In the case of Rothenburg, it is a medieval city. There's some gorgeous, gorgeous images of it online. So that was easy. With Ancona, I use tourist sites a lot of times to just sort of get a feel for the city, and obviously also artwork from earlier periods. I was able to get to Israel for the sequel of Beyond the Ghetto Gates, not Egypt, but Israel. And I was definitely in both London and Stratford-upon-Avon for my verse novel about William Shakespeare. So that one, we were like completely immersed in that.
What part of Italy is Ancona?
So if you know where Venice is,
Oh, yes.
it's down the coastline.
Okay.
It's this beautiful harbor city. They have some gorgeous things in it. I'm very much looking forward to finally getting there.
Absolutely want to get there. Sounds beautiful. Any questions for Michelle, for our author today?
Yes, I'd like to know who the other writers are that inspire you, please.
Okay, so definitely, I read a lot of historical fiction, and I know a lot of historical fiction writers. A couple I don't know are, oh goodness, I'm blanking on her name. She wrote Hamnet. She's got a new book out.
Maggie O'Farrell?
Maggie O'Farrell is just amazing. Again, I had to force myself to read the book because it's so brilliant, and I had written about Shakespeare, and I was frankly jealous of this woman's ability. She's amazing. Emma Donohue's Slammerkin. Michelle Moran, who wrote about the Madame Tussaud, I think wrote one of the most brilliant descriptions of the French Revolution. Stephanie Cowles, Claude and Camille. So yeah, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them out there. Yeah.
I have another question. How do you, or what do you recommend for writers, how to turn off the self-editing while you're writing?
It's so hard. Because I think every writer has that. When I'm teaching our beginning year novelist students, I talk about the problem of perfectionism. I talk about the fact that you really, if you are going to perfect that chapter before you move on to the next, the problem is that often when you get into revision and you look at the whole, that what will happen is you'll say, okay, that chapter I spent 3 months writing, I shouldn't even have it in the book. So, you know, so I always say don't bog down in the first draft. Keep it moving. You will go back and correct, you will go back, but perfectionism is definitely a problem for writers. So you want to avoid that, absolutely.
Another question.
Go ahead.
In your writers group, do you recommend using or use as tools Stephen King's On Writing and the book about writing that Amy Tan also wrote?
Right. There's some wonderful books out there. I mean, Stephen King is brilliant. I don't love his books because it's just not my genre, but his book On Writing is amazing. Bird by Bird is another really fabulous book for writers. I take bits and pieces out of them. You know, I don't, you know, we don't use them as, you know, texts, but I will definitely make recommendations based on my own reading from those books. And I know, I mean, a lot of my writers will ask for suggestions, and we do have a whole list.
I'm going to ask, based on the self-editing question, very popular is the NaNoWriMo, or, you know, just get it down on the page and then go back.
Right.
So is that the kind of recommendation for like the no self-editing, or?
I have mixed feelings about NaNoWriMo. I don't think you can write, first of all, you know, I write much longer books than the 50,000 words. Mm-hmm. But I have good friends who use NaNoWriMo every year for some kind of project or other. And there is something to be said for show up every single day and write. So yeah, I understand people who do it, who use it as sort of a goad to keep going. I don't do it myself.
Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
It really was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure chatting with you. I learned a lot, and I look forward to your future books.
Thank you so much. It really was a pleasure being here.
Thanks.